This is Dan McLaughlin. You're watching the Break It Down Show.
Dan McLaughlin from National Review, a senior writer, is on the show with us. I imagine we'll probably talk a little bit of politics, a little bit of current events. But I thought because you've written a blog, everybody should go to his blog page. I'll put that here in the notes in a second. But I thought we should talk a little bit of baseball first, if you're comfortable talking about baseball, because you've written about it quite a bit.
Fire away.
Okay, so I've had Rob Nyer on the show a bunch of times. He's probably going to be on again here as soon as we hit the playoffs. I know quite a bit about baseball. What are your thoughts on the changes this year with the extra inning rules, universal DH, and the relievers having to face three batters? That's a good primer to start us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the rule changes, a lot of them are things that we can live with for 1 year because, this is extraordinary circumstances. But I am very concerned that some of these rules, almost all of which are bad, are going to stick around after this year, that the owners have basically used this as a kind of camel's nose in the tent to stick with things like, the phantom base runner during extra innings, the shortening of games during double headers, and the expanded playoff format. The doubleheader thing doesn't bother me maybe as much, only because under more normal circumstances, doubleheaders are very rare today. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it offends me to see 7-inning games, like, as if we're playing Little League here.
Right.
But fundamentally, doubleheaders are a very small part of the game today. They're a much larger part this year because we've had so many games rescheduled. And simply because, the season is shorter, so it's harder to reschedule a game, period, to find open space within the game and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and some of these rules have been in exchange for player benefits. The rosters are bigger, which the players always love that. I'm sure the doubleheader thing being 7 innings is good for the I think the players want to play a little less. 18 innings in a day is a long time. I can understand that part of it. And then also the extra expansion during doubleheaders to have an extra player even still, for the roster. I can see those things being exchanges. But in general, are any of these rules for you a good addition to carry on? Okay, the camel's nose is in the tent. Let's whap the camel on the nose and back him out. But let one rule change in. Which one would it be?
The one that I like, that I have been actually pushing for 20 years, is having relievers required to face three batters. I think that's actually a traditionalist rule. I mean, if in the very earliest, like 19th century days of the game, there were restrictions on substitution, restrictions on replacing the pitcher. So we're getting a little bit back to that because, it's really only in the last 25 years or so that it became common to see pitchers enter and exit the game and only having faced one or two batters. So that rule I like. Okay. The other thing in terms of economics here is that I think the expanded DH rule is also one that the players like. It creates more jobs and more high-end jobs. I did an economic analysis of this some years ago, and there's no question that the DH rule, it first of all creates another everyday job, right? Because you've got now 9 everyday hitters plus your pitching staff instead of 8. And it tends to keep players in the game longer, right? The DHs tend to make more money than the rest of the guys because they tend to be older, established players who come up for free agency. So economically, the expanding of the DH rule also, is something that's very much in the economic interest of the players.
Yeah, I agree. And then there's young players that have a chance to play. I would say someone like, well, look, for my hometown, a guy that's got a ton of pop. I mean, inch for inch, no one's got more power than Willie Calhoun. But he was never going to be a regular Dodger player because he just doesn't really have the ability to play defense at a championship level. Maybe for a second division team, but he's with the DH, he can play on any team in any league. And that's great because there's a kid that absolutely, he's so good with power, Dan. I don't know if you've seen this at all. He can clown. He can imitate somebody's swing and still hit a home run in a live game. He's done it in AAA. I'm positive he can do it in the major leagues. But he wouldn't have a role in the National League if there wasn't a DH. And same thing with another Dodger prospect, Edwin Rios is primarily going to be a DH because of his enormous power. What a threat he is, but he's not gifted on defense. And so here's a chance for even young guys to get jobs early.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, this is actually another of the reasons people talk about like the effect of expansion on the game, right? Why historically has scoring gone up whenever you have a year when you have expansion? Well, part of it is because pitching talent is rarer, but it's also because when you bring up guys who can't make the majors into your pitching staff, it's because they're bad at pitching. But
Hmm.
a lot of the guys who are trapped, not quite these kind of quadruple A players who can't quite make the majors as hitters, very often it's because they're major league hitters who can't field. Um, as often as they are guys who are, good defensive players or base runners who can't hit.
Yeah, for sure. That glove is the biggest part. Like if you can crush the ball with the DH, you can always play. But if you can't field, it's like, what can we do with you? You can be a dangerous guy off the bench late in the game, but that's not the career anybody wants. Another quick question: with this short season, we're seeing a lot of kind of bunching in terms of MVP candidates. I mean, the Dodgers have, and I'm a Dodger fan, so I know them the best. That's why I keep bringing them up. But they've got three guys that have MVP level numbers, but so do the Braves, and so do a lot of teams. So how do we determine what's valuable? I know it's kind of gone towards a sabermetric approach to say this person was, the most brilliant, but in terms of value to a team, whether it's dollar for dollar or being the guy that was clutch. I mean, Kirk Gibson didn't have the best numbers in '88 when he won. These kind of MVPs happen all the time. So, what do you think does it do to this bunching? Because we haven't had a long season to separate what truly is valuable.
Yeah, as a Mets fan, I'm still bitter about the MVP award going to Gibson, but uh,
30
I,
years
I
ago. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I don't think obviously for award purposes you look at dollar for dollar. Although certainly from the team's perspective that matters quite a lot.
Yeah.
But I think I mean I think you always start with the numbers, and you try to look at a serious evaluation of that. But very often you get MVP votes and Cy Young votes where the players are fairly comparable statistically, and that's where I think you can start to bring in the tiebreakers and say, wait a minute, this guy he came up with big plays at particularly important times that his team really, he really made a decisive difference in a close pennant race, um, things like that. I mean, I think, I remember doing a breakdown of the AL race in AL pennant race in I think '99 or 2000, and just sort of comparing where the Red Sox what the Red Sox looked like when Pedro Martinez wasn't pitching,
Right.
and they were a 500 team, and this is
Yes.
'99, I guess, because he went like 23-4,
Right.
and if you slotted in an average pitcher, there was no question that they weren't going anywhere.
You look at a team, two teams, the Braves and the Dodgers, have a trio of hitters that are MVP grade. Whether they win it or not, regardless, they'll all get votes. But neither of these teams was expected to do anything except for compete. So they're already fulfilling what we expected of them. The Dodgers are so good; they've got three MVP candidates, and their MVP from last year isn't one of them. I mean, it's hard to be most valuable when you have that much depth. And the same thing with the Braves. You've got three guys at or above 1,000 OPS. Do we have to look at? Do we automatically tie break them out and say we're not even going to consider that because there's so much talent there? It's hard to be most valuable in a league when you're backed up by that much support.
Well, I mean, if you're looking at, I mean, your example of Kirk Gibson in '88, why did Gibson win? Well, because like the Mets vote was divided among Strawberry and McReynolds, and the same thing happened to the Mets in '86. They had too many MVP candidates. Um, so that has certainly happened over the years where teams that have multiple plausible candidates, the voting gets divided. Maybe not intentionally,
Mm.
but it just kind of naturally works out that way. I mean, the Braves obviously are also doing this because the National League East is a garbage fire.
Yeah, the Marlins got out to that early great start and have literally been 500-ish, since then, and yet they're still competitive because they had an early great start, and there isn't 100 more games to sort out if they're good or not. Here's kind of a fun question: who is the Kevin McReynolds today? Like for a while, I would say Bobby Abreu was that guy. Where sort of great at a lot of things, but not brilliant. Or enough to be an elite player, but damn, you loved having him on your team.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, well, I think Abreu was a much better player.
Yeah, he was better.
McReynolds too, but yeah. I mean, in terms of all, I mean, one guy who I think I mean, he's very much at an elite level, but one guy who kind of sticks out as a guy who is much more of an all around guy than a guy who does one thing in particular is Bregman. In Houston, you compare him to, because they have a lot of players on that team who do one or two things really, really well. And, so Bregman, I think, is a guy who does a whole lot of different things. Maybe none of there isn't kind of anything that he's the best on the team at doing. But he's just a totally complete player.
What about who are your white horse and your dark horse for the playoffs in both leagues?
I don't know. I mean, I do think that the Dodgers are pretty imposing looking at this point. And they have the deep bullpen, which particularly in an exceptionally long set. When you're talking about a long march through the playoffs with a lot of short series, you're going to be leaning on your bullpen really hard. And so those relievers who may not be all that important, comparatively speaking, in the regular season, I think become much more vital in the postseason. And this many short series, it's hard to really put big bank on starting pitchers. I mean, yeah, if you have a 3-game, best like 3 out of 5 game series, then yeah, your number one starting pitcher assumes outsized importance. But when you have those over and over and over again, then it's hard to keep clicking on, being able to rely on using your number one guy twice. But your ace relievers, they're going to be there every single night. And if you have, and you have to have the bullpen depth to be able to not burn them all, not just burn one guy out.
Yeah, and the Dodgers and several other teams like the A's, they just have arms forever. So it's not just that they have depth, they have quality in that depth, and they're able to, the Dodgers just lost a guy to Tommy John surgery, and it's like almost like it doesn't matter. They're like, yeah, but we're going to bump some of our starters back into the relief role. It's just ridiculous. What about dark horses?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm skeptical of putting too much. I mean, these teams like the White Sox that just don't look. That I don't think anybody expected to be this good. But I'm not sure I'd put that much stock in them. I mean, anything can happen in a short series and in a series of short series. But I don't know that I would bank that heavily on any of the teams that are kind of weirdly dark horse looking.
And it doesn't seem like there's a lot of room at the very bottom of the league to move in. Like we're just out of time for surprises, and almost everybody because there's 8 teams, like it's just there's not a lot of room for anybody to get in if they're below 500. Maybe 1 or 2 teams will, but just the dark horse thing is going to settle out. Is this the A's year? They've always been competitive in terms of putting teams together and surprising us. Do they finally catch a break this year?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, they do sort of as usual have a whole, they are relying as usual on a whole bunch of people who are not big names, guys who are fairly early in their careers, other than like Matt Chapman. But I don't know. We'll see. I mean, it is in some ways in some ways it's a postseason that is more regular season-ish, just in the sense that that you do have this repetitive cycle of short series. But I don't know. I mean, it's funny historically if you think about it, right? Because up until the Billy Beane era, the A's were the absolute apex of boom and bust, right? I mean, for a century almost, they were, almost every A's team that was any good at all was a dominant franchise, and anytime they weren't winning the pennant, they were finishing last. They had these long series. I mean, and that was all driven by the economic structure of the team, right? Connie Mack and Charlie Finley, they would just build these juggernaut franchises and then sell them out. Whereas, Beane has managed, even though the team has been as financially strapped as ever, to keep sort of bleeding talent out rather than just dumping it all at once and keeping the pipeline going.
Yeah, they've had to redefine what valuable is, and they often get to set the market at that. Like for a while they were looking for fastball hitters that were powerful low in the zone, and so they specifically looked for that talent. And because not everybody was able to see that, they were able to corner the market on these players. But that advantage moves around. But especially if a team doesn't take the statistical analysis side seriously, or they underfund it, you get way far behind, because there's teams that are, they have more people on their analysis staff than they have on the major league roster. For sure, the
Yeah,
Dodgers, for sure, the Astros do that.
yeah, and I mean that's the thing. I mean, at the time of Moneyball and all of that, there was the idea that there was a competitive advantage there, and that's now it's the opposite. It's not that you can get a competitive advantage; it's that you have to be doing that just to be in the game.
Right.
I mean, I guess if there's a team that I think is kind of a fun and wild team to watch, but they're obviously not going to surprise anybody given the regular season, is the Padres. I mean that's a team where you have a couple of young stud starters and a couple of big bats. So I think they'll certainly be a lot of fun to watch in October.
When we look at teams that are underfunded, like the A's, like Tampa Bay or whatever, they call them small market teams, but there's nothing small about having access to. I mean, the Bay. What is it? I mean, if you count Sacramento as being part of the Bay Area, which we should, there's 7 million people there. Miami has 7 million people in its metro area, and I think that doesn't include what goes north on the Space Coast side.
Yeah, I
There's
mean,
a lot of people.
I mean, well, of course, the A's problem is that they have to share that market with the Giants,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, some of the small markets are kind of self-fulfilling prophecies in a sense. That if a team has failed to build a fan base, that they may have a large market that they could potentially tap into, but they just haven't succeeded in doing it. Some of them obviously, like Kansas City, are genuinely small markets, but I mean, I think the problem has been that Florida has just not, that they've yet to really find a way to bring in big revenue streams, either in Tampa or in Miami. And I think there's some debate about why that is. I mean, you might be tempted in Miami to point the finger at the fact that you have like a large Latin American population, but that's a lot of those are folks who either came here or the descendants of people who came here from countries where baseball is quite popular. So there's no particular reason you shouldn't be able to build a baseball fan base out of that. And the same with the fact that you have a lot of like older transplants from New York. Well, New York's a great baseball town. Yeah, some of those people are still Yankees fans, but you should be able to win them over.
We just had a guy recently on. The podcast version is going to come out here in a few days, but sometimes you need a cultural moment that you really can't control. So the Dodgers, built their stadium in a place called Chavez Ravine. It was a failed government project site. And so they eminent domained them out and brought in the Dodgers, which was good for the community as a whole. But, for a long time, the Mexican community in LA rejected the Dodgers because of how they treated, these families that didn't want to leave. Then Fernando Valenzuela came along, and if you can say out loud in English Doyers instead of Dodgers, and nobody even blinks an eye. It doesn't sound like Spanish. It just sounds like, yeah, that's the team. That's how powerful that gear shift was for them. And you can try to create that in Miami, but they've lied to their audience so often. I don't know that you can reliably make something happen there that makes people come to that ballpark. It's Miami. There's a lot of great things to do, but they're a terrible form of boom and bust. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think they definitely have burned a lot of goodwill by having repeatedly, two different times that you won championships, and then instead of cashing in on it, immediately torched the team to the ground. And particularly since those were championships for the most part that were won with a lot of players who had only just recently been imported onto the roster. So you just didn't give people a chance to build up, to build up a connection to the team. I mean, obviously Jose Fernandez was something that they couldn't have planned that.
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean the Marlins have just that they really are a case study for not putting the effort into into building a connection with your fans. The Fernando mania, though, I mean, yeah, it's I think people who were not old enough to have lived through that maybe don't quite grasp exactly what a cultural phenomenon
Yeah,
Valenzuela was.
it was crazy. I want to say one thing about that era of the Marlins and the era slightly before that. When they had Logan Morrison and at the time Mike Stanton, and just like all these great players that went on to do other things in other places. Dan Ugla, they brought a lot of talent in to open that stadium up, and they literally took one season and said never mind all of that and destroyed that team as well. Then you lose Jose Fernandez to a tragedy. They didn't even win a championship that time. They literally did. It's like they had enough money for 1 year and then destroyed that team.
Yeah, I mean, I think that team I'm a little less inclined to blame them for, because I think they probably did make a rational calculation that they had built their window of competition around like two or three guys, and Fernandez was one of them. And once he was out of the picture, it just was not going to work. But it hit yet again the deep well of mistrust of them as a real franchise.
Yeah, they really went after the Spanish market. I mean, they brought the former Met Reyes in to play shortstop, and apparently he was done, and no one knew, or they weren't good enough to recognize it. Mike Stanton, Miguel Cabrera. They had a lot of talent, but you're right. They just, it's hard to run a team when you can't get fans to show. It's that chicken and the egg, and you're trying to make something that happen. I want to say one other thing too about I met Michael Brito, the guy that's like the Dodgers Mexican scout, exemplar. Anybody who's watched a Dodger games, seen him. He wears the Panama Jack hat behind home plate. He found and got to the major leagues, Fernando Valenzuela, and fill in the list of names after that. He's got 2 championship rings, Dan, right? And they're on his left arm, and he wears them on his pinky and his ring finger, and he walks around like this. Like his left arm is too heavy. I swear to God, he's like he walks leaning because he's got these 2 championship rings, and the rings are so big. I don't know if it's just by habit or if it's just part of his strut, but it's pretty cool. And he wears them like all the time. Like he doesn't pull them out of the safe. He wears them all the time. It's pretty cool.
Well, Yogi Berra never had that problem of being weighed down only on one side. So
no, he didn't. He had to get slings to hold him up. Okay, I want to transition into what you do for a day job, writing for the National Review and other places, that kind of thing. And your latest article, it talks about Joe Biden's age, and it matters even more if he wins. One of the things that has kind of captured a lot of us on, at least on, on Twitter and that kind of thing, is this offer from Joe Rogan to host a debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Donald Trump, for those who don't know, instantly says, "I'm in," because he just doesn't care. He's ready to go. And not a peep from Joe Biden. I see that as a mistake. If you want to run this country, Joe Biden's got tens of millions of people already watching his stuff every month. What are your thoughts on the offer and then the response or lack thereof from Joe Biden?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and one thing that is clear. I mean, talking about Biden's age, look, I think there's no question that Joe Biden, 10, 12 years ago would have accepted that, right? Because he's a guy who could, sort of talk the ears off the proverbial brass monkey, right? But and he's just not that guy anymore. And it's just I don't know how people who've watched him for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years can deny that he's just not the same man anymore. I mean, look, I think Biden is taking a somewhat rational calculation or rational gamble here that he's far enough ahead that he doesn't need to break out of the traditional mold, that he can stick to the typical staged podium debates and everything, and he'll probably given one of the more ridiculous but somehow predictive metrics in presidential elections, that he won't have to worry about standing next to Trump and Trump getting to show off the fact that he's taller than Biden. But it's a format. I mean, I think the format that Rogan is offering is one that would be great if you had 2 candidates who were really, fairly evenly matched, or 2 candidates who were fairly, fast and stable on their feet. Trump and Biden are both kind of, wild throw things at the wall guys, but and I think neither one of them is quite as on top of things as they once were, um, but Trump, I think, at least has not lost the ability to just sort of BS his way through things at a fairly rapid clip, and that I think is the very skill that Biden once had in spades and no longer possesses, and I think that's clearly why he's worried about what can happen if you just sort of let them loose in an unstructured, hours long format.
Which is a shame because being the president is pretty unstructured at times. You get things thrust upon you that you just can't possibly be prepared for.
Yeah, although you get to call the shots of your own schedule, and in fact, the fact that presidents spend almost all of their time doing things on their own terms is one reason why presidential incumbents usually do so badly in debates. Even though the debates are, even as structured as the debates are, they are a bit of a cession of control, and that's why. I mean, if you looked, that's why Bush. George W. Bush in 2004 and Barack Obama in 2012. They did, and Reagan in '84 all did really badly. I mean, Carter did not do great in 1980, and of course, to Carter's, ill effect for Carter's campaign, unlike the other campaigns, instead of being the first three debates, there was only one debate that year, and it was a week before the election. And I think if I remember right, 80 million people watched the debate and 83 million people voted in the election. So easily the most consequential debate in presidential history because it was, because of the size of the audience and only being one debate and so close to the election.
When you look at the debate in the format that it's in now, it's fairly traditional, sponsored by a given network, broadcast on all the different channels. Is there a certain question you'd want to ask these guys, like to kind of, and it could be a question for each, but what do you want to hear, and do you think these questions are possible to come out of what's there, or is this all closed off enough that it's not going to happen, that we're going to get real questions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be frank here. I can't think of a single thing that I would want to hear either of these two men answer, just because of the nature of who they are and how they answer questions. I think, I think there's a long list of things Biden hasn't been grilled on. But at the same time, there's plenty of things that I would like to see, certainly, my background, in addition to being a writer, my background is as a lawyer. This is really only this year that I went into writing full time, finally, after 23 years of practicing law. And I do think that the debate questioners, and the press questioners at press conferences and the congressional questioners at hearings are often terrible at asking questions that are designed to elicit information, as opposed to, the worst obviously is when you get people who are there who are just kind of grandstanding to give their own speech, and they're kind of doing their okay, I will talk for 5 minutes and then conclude it with "How dare you?" Right? That's not how you ask a question. And frankly, if you're dealing with somebody who's not a completely cooperative, person you're questioning, you don't ask a multi-part question. Maybe you hope for a follow-up or you try to negotiate a follow-up, but you really have to ask something that calls for a very specific piece of information and doesn't give a lot of wiggle room.
You've hit on a nerve with that. I mean, I stopped watching the news quite a while ago when I recognized, things like all the adjectives that are put in that are unnecessary. As a spy, my job is to go out and find out what's going on. I get to analyze, but that's a different section of the report, right? Up top is what I observed. You take all the extra nonsense out. You can say something was big or whatever, but you don't put your own opinion as to what you saw in there unless you have like a specific note. When I hear the question in the press briefing room, why did you lie to the American people? I think you've let us all down with that question. I mean, if the president's doing a terrible job, do your job and illustrate what happened. But when you start with, why did you lie to the American people? I now can't trust what you do because you've started by analyzing before your question even happened.
Yeah, and like, everybody in journalism wants to be, is it Joseph Welch? The asking, at long last, sir, have you no decency? But you got to remember that Welch only got to that point because he that was the end of a very long, build up, and you don't get to give that speech making conclusion. Unless you've laid a lot of groundwork. And frankly, I mean, look, if you're like a trial lawyer, you don't ask that question, right?
Right.
You ask the factual questions when the guy's on the stand, and then when it's closing argument time and he's not there to bicker with you, that's when you say, has he no decency?
That's a different part of the report. Yeah, it's the same thing on the spy end of the game. I can't say, what day are you planning to blow us up? Because that question will never be answered in a way that does anybody any damn good. So what is the best question in that environment? And that's the key thing. Let's talk foreign policy real quick, because my own firsthand experience, I would love to handle the foreign policy debate because I'll just talk about the ground truth and what happens, So I can't see how Joe Biden can even show up for any kind of foreign policy question. And then Donald Trump has, he's been stacking up wins, even if they're little stepping stones. He seems, and shocking to me, I didn't think this was going to happen. He seems to have a knack for foreign policy. What are your thoughts regarding foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, I have very mixed feelings about Trump's foreign policy. I'm obviously not a fan of almost anything Biden has ever done in that area. I wrote a big piece the other day on sort of the big glaring weakness that I don't think Biden has really been asked about at all in this campaign. But I don't know what he can say other than revisionist history, which is the rather extensive record of showing that Biden was against the raid that got Osama bin Laden, and he was clearly the one guy in the room who was most against it. I mean, Gates was also against it, and kind of waffled on that. But it's very, very clear that Biden was opposed to it. He tried to make up a story a few years later about how he supposedly went to Obama privately afterwards and said otherwise. But Obama has never said anything of that nature, and no. When Biden went around and said that stuff, the White House's answer was no comment, and then Biden officially announced the following day that he wasn't running for president in 2016. So, and that I think is one thing that certainly Trump and Pence both hit Biden on very quickly in the convention speeches. But I almost was surprised that Republicans didn't make a bigger and lengthier deal of it, because it's such an obvious such an obvious contrast, because it's actually one of the it's a contrast both to Obama, right? Because getting bin Laden was really the high point of Obama's presidency, and because taking out al-Baghdadi and Soleimani are really two of the high points of Trump's foreign policy. So I mean, the big question to me, one of the biggest questions, and maybe it's not as urgent a question because it's a war fighting question, and we're currently in a situation where nobody is proposing wars on the table, is this ongoing problem that we've had all the way back to the 50s of to Korea and Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, of that we don't seem to know how to define who we're fighting and where we're fighting them, and specifically we don't seem to be able to deal with the problem of when we go somewhere to fight an enemy and they get help from across the border, or they're able to take refuge across the border, or there are people coming across the border to fight us, which certainly is a big thing that led to getting Soleimani, right? Is that he had crossed the border into Iraq, that we were able to get him in Iraq. But it seems to me that until the United States has a more thought out approach to what we do when people are crossing borders, and this is, I wrote a piece that was kind of debunking some of the reporting on the Russian bounties, right, in Afghanistan, that this was all reported as if it was happening when it's clearly just something that there's chatter on the ground about, but that we haven't, that nobody's been able to find actionable intelligence. And it wouldn't shock me if it's true, but at this point, we just don't have a reliable basis to believe it's true.
Well, let me put some
if,
color into. Let me put some color into some of the things you're saying. My own foreign policy encounter, not direct knowledge, but firsthand knowledge. When Biden came to Iraq, once the Obama Biden team were in office, he came to work on extending or solidifying the SOFA into an actual status of forces agreement. This is the contract for everybody listening between the American government and the Iraqi government on what the rules are for having the American forces there. And Maliki is in his room and he's like the champ. He doesn't come out right away. He makes Biden wait because Biden, this is the words that he said. And one of the guys I got to know pretty well was an interpreter for the commander of all of the American forces. And I knew because I knew him when he was a commander's interpreter at lower levels. So he had graduated up and we'd worked in the same area a lot. And he said, the other interpreter was talking to me saying that Maliki was pissed because the United States sent number 2 and I'm number 1. 1 talks to 1, not 1 talks to 2. And that may or may not be true, but it makes sense because he did make Biden wait, and then Biden wasn't able to put a deal together. If you're in that room trying to sort this out, you've got to get that deal. You've got to do something better than that. And the foreign policy chops to not know that, to not understand the kind of man Maliki is, it's wanting. And then the other thing is defining what victory is in terms of like who we're fighting, and understanding that there's not going to be a force that's going to stand up on another hillside. You're not going to be able to close the gate and kill these people. It just doesn't happen that way anymore. They don't want to fight that way. And so our refusal to accept that, to understand that there are going to be cross-border incursions and escapes, we miss the opportunity to win these fights and literally don't have the capacity to do it because we work on a straight conventional fight all the time, which is an important skill to maintain, but we don't take the time to prepare for the fight that we have. And so when Joe Biden or President Trump send us forward, we're literally prepared at like a 15% level to deal with the conflict that we're fighting. And it's not a belligerent, it's co-belligerence. We're all fighting for different things. We want to fight a force, but there's no force there to fight. So everybody's competing for different things. And it's just chaotic and maddening for the host nation to deal with in all frankness.
Yeah, particularly when you're dealing with places like Afghanistan and Iraq, where there's not clear lines of division. There's a whole bunch of different players who have their own agendas and a bunch of different foreign players with their own agendas. I mean, honestly, I was never convinced that the Obama administration was sincere at all about wanting a status of forces agreement. I think they were all too happy to blame it on Bush, despite the fact that Bush clearly didn't get the status of forces agreement in 2008 because for all sorts of obvious reasons, he didn't have the political capital to do it. He didn't have the domestic capital. He didn't have the international credibility to say, if you don't deal with me today, you're going to deal with me tomorrow, when they knew that, he wasn't going to be there tomorrow. And the odds were pretty good that it was somebody who wanted something very different who was going to be replacing him.
Yeah. And to be fair, we were pretty far apart with them on that whole situation, we were never going to allow the Iraqi court to judge our service members, and that wasn't going to change. But again, Joe Biden wasn't able to figure out a way to make that work in a way that made sense.
Yeah. I read a lot of, I do a lot of 19th century history these days. And I mean, that's one of the great things when you read about, like Lincoln. Lincoln was absolutely a guy who, if he thought that you needed to get him in the room to do the deal, he would put himself in the room to do the deal, right? He famously even let like McLaughlin keep him waiting in his parlor, like while McLaughlin keeps Lincoln cooling his heels. Who deals with a president like that, right? And maybe that was not as decisive as it needed to be, but at the time Lincoln realized that he couldn't afford to get rid of McClellan yet, so he was willing to basically sort of kiss his boots. And at the end of the war, when the Confederacy sends this delegation that probably doesn't really have authority, didn't have authority, in fact, to make terms. Yet, Lincoln goes to Hampton Roads himself, with the Secretary of State in tow. He makes it very, very clear that, like, look, if there is any possibility of a deal here to end the war, I'm here, I'm in the room, I can make the deal.
Hmm. I wanted to go back also and mention Russian bounties real quick too. As again, as a spy, a guy outside the wire, like it's that there are bounties. You hear this intel all the time, whether it's real or not. Like it's in no way a shock to me that any nation that is adversarial towards us, and then there's a higher bounty if you're a female. There's a higher bounty if you're. There's literally been intel reports I've had my hands on, and it says capture Pete, like my first name, and some kind of action that's not going to be good towards me, and a bounty. I mean that it's combat. Like, of course, they're going to target. We do the same thing. We don't pay people money, but we definitely pay bounties if you give us Bin Laden or whatever. But internally, the U.S. forces aren't going to get a bonus, but they'll get an award. They'll get recognition. So, I mean, the bounty thing is almost ridiculous. Of course, people are incented to take action against an adversary. It doesn't make anybody a bad president. And actually, it's not presidential business, it's commander business. And so, like, what's Donald Trump going to do? He's going to go to Putin and say, are you putting bounties on our service members? No. Okay, good. Leave. Meeting over. I mean, come on. Like it's a ridiculous non-starting conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole problem with, more broadly speaking, with dealing with Putin is the fact that, I think we keep making this mistake of trying to, work out our relationship with Putin independently of all of these other things that he's got his fingers in, and that, the idea that I mean, you can't settle on a Russia policy that isn't connected to your Iran policy, your China policy, your Afghanistan policy, your Germany and the Baltics policy. And I mean, right now, we probably have to deal with the reality that we have to remain, antagonistic to Putin on some fronts, and cooperate with him on a very transactional level, perhaps in some other fronts. But I think the idea that you can actually have like a broader rapprochement with Putin, you can't do that unless you're ready to either eliminate the Iranian regime, or decouple him from the Iranian regime, and that's Iran and Afghanistan are obviously not. Those are not just like sort of far away adventures from the Russian perspective. That's their doorstep, and those are places they've been involved in for centuries.
Yeah, and the natural resources that they require. I want to ask another question on foreign policy, but I guess I'll just continue with this line here. So when you look at that, when you look at Russia's need to provide oil and energy to itself, China's need to provision its gigantic middle class, which is exploding. These places strategically need to provide and maintain, stability. And that oftentimes does not jive with what we want to have happen for our stability and long-term safety and protecting our partners. How does one, and are either of these candidates capable of handling that very delicate balance between China needs these things to stay reasonable and, hey, China's stealing our technology to the tune of trillions of dollars?
Not really. No, I don't think so. But
Okay.
I mean, I think on China. Look, I give Trump some credit on China in the sense
Okay.
that I think just his sheer sort of vocal and visceral, tendency to blame China, which is tied into his trade ideas that are, I think trade is the one area where I give Trump credit for sincerity. I don't necessarily agree with all of his views on trade, but I think he's been very, very consistent going back to the '80s on how he thinks about trade.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that as much as anything drove his approach to China, and I think that Trump's just how vocal he has been about China has really shifted the Overton window, if you will, the needle of public policy discussion, that I don't think you can necessarily. I don't think even Biden, who has a certain amount of kind of interest in pro-China, I don't think he can put things back to where they were. I don't think there's a reset button you can hit with China that gets us to where we were 6 or 7 years ago, where there was kind of a bipartisan leave China alone implicit attitude. Like a lot of these things are on the table now that were not on the table before, and it's going to be hard to put them away. But I think the broader chess game of figuring out how do you put all the pieces together to cut deals with China and cut deals against China. I don't know that I see the strategic vision there from Trump, and certainly not from Biden.
When President Trump ran, he ran on a number of promises. Oddly enough, he seems to be doing. Look, we don't have to agree with his success level, but he seems to be trying to enact the things he said he was going to do, and it really shouldn't be surprising. But it appears that he runs the nation like a business. He's like, "Hey, we got a bad deal here. You're not paying your invoices there. Hey, who are you? Let's figure out if we can work." He really does those things. I don't know if he can run the United States like a business. So I want your comments on that, but I also want to get your comments as a lawyer, especially on we've lost control of the presidency, like the president, whoever it is, with the ever increasing use of executive orders, and then how the president is bypassing Congress altogether with these things. Is this something that is this horse out of the barn, or is this something that we can get control of, or is this the way we're going to have to do this now to get past gridlock and heal our nation? So kind of a complex question, but dealing with the EO thing and I think I see that as being like the biggest potential for disaster. And then also the president's technique of running the country like a business.
Yeah, I'm not a hostile witness, so I'll let you off the hook for asking a compound question.
Good.
So, yeah, well, look, I think it is definitely true of Trump, much as it was true of George W. Bush, by the way, at least in his domestic policy, that if you look at Trump's pre-presidential career, whether you love him or hate him or somewhere in between, and you look at how he has run the executive branch, it's not that shocking. It's not that surprising. It's not that big a departure. I mean, Trump's businesses, which have, got a good deal of mixed success and failure there. But Trump's businesses, the thing to remember, too, is that they were very much his personal fiefdoms, right? Trump never managed like a big publicly traded corporation that had to answer to shareholders and everything. So within that parameter, yeah, I mean, I think Trump thinks of the executive branch in the same way fundamentally that he thought of his own business operations. I think where that's gotten him obviously in the most trouble is in the area of overseeing law enforcement and investigations and right. The sorts of things where, this just doesn't happen to the boss in, when you're running the Trump organization, but you're running the federal government and it does. Yes. But I do think one thing that is very positive to come out of in an ironic way, one thing that's very positive to come out of the Trump term for Republicans, even though Trump hasn't really actually delivered on a lot of the things he promised, I think he's delivered on the idea that he delivered on his promises. It's not like we have a border wall with Mexico. They put up some additional fencing. It's not like we actually have a better trade deal with China, but he has certainly at least, gone into a trade war with China and been able to reach some small agreements. But I think he has at least refocus the party, hopefully, on the idea that you have to make promises that are concrete, that are tangible, that people can see, and you have to go about, showing people that you kept those promises. I think that was a huge part of the rise of Trump was the loss of faith among Republican voters that Republicans, whether it be moderate Republicans, conservative Republicans, establishment Republicans, Tea Party Republicans, that Republican leaders actually meant the stuff they were saying, that they meant their promises, that they meant their principles. I think unfortunately what got overlooked in the 2016 election was that we had a number of governors running who actually did have a very good record of delivering on their promises. Different governors with different issues of their own, of course, but I think that if the party generally takes away the message from the Trump years, that we need to go back to being more serious about showing people that we mean the stuff we say. That, for example, that we're not going to promise them, John McCain, build the dang fence and then turn around on that. Even Rubio, who I think was a fantastic candidate in a lot of ways, but he had turned around against the things he promised in his 2010 Senate campaign on immigration that left a lot of people unwilling to ever trust him again. So I do think that the idea, at least, of promise keeping is a very, very important one. You know, as far as the other issue of executive orders, I mean, I think this is a huge problem with our executive branch generally, and you know, the erosion of the entire concept of separation of powers, but also the erosion of, at the same time, presidential control of the administrative state. And so you have this problem that's kind of running both ways. I was actually just doing a book event the other day for Jim Copeland from the Manhattan Institute. Has a new book out called The Unelected, which kind of ties together a lot of those the executive orders and administrative state and other aspects of that, which I think was an interesting read. It's an issue I've come back to a lot. I do think that if we just get in the habit of presidents handing down fiats instead of going to Capitol Hill, that is the way away from, you know, the essence of our small r Republican government, small d Democratic government that is designed in the Constitution and that we really depend on.
Yeah, it's well, I would love to talk to him, by the way. So after the show, let's exchange emails and hopefully get an intro, because I would love to have him on to discuss that some more. One of the questions that Brad asked, right in the same vein, is how much and what parts of Trumpism do you see being absorbed into conservatism? You know, he's not the best Republican, but he is the leader of the party right now. So what's going to stick?
Yeah, well, I think on the one hand, you have to remember that there's a huge amount of follow the leaderism in any political party, really, as well as there's a lot of, you know, everybody wants to be the winner. And so I think Trump gained, I think if you look at Trump's approval within the party, right, he was enormously more popular within the party after winning the election than he was before that. And a huge amount of that just comes back to the fact that a lot of Republicans spent 25 years thinking, how can anybody take down the Clintons? And spent a decade thinking, how can we get back to the White House, you know, after Obama? And so there was just a sense that, like, okay, this guy won. So obviously, whether or not Trump wins again is going to have a big impact on how people view him. I think people will be surprised by how different the party looks when we have another Republican president after this who is maybe different from Trump. You know, people who were big Nixon people went to being big Reagan people, and they went to being George W. Bush. You know, people who were big George W. Bush people became big Trump people. And this doesn't make sense until you realize that they're still, you know, they're with the tribe. They're with, you know, they're willing to follow the leader. And leadership really does matter an awful lot in that sense, in setting the agenda, setting the tone of the party. But I think there's no question that even aside from the promise keeping point, I think there is, you know, I think people want to see a president who fights against the other side. And they, you know, I think the kind of the Buchananism parts of Trump, that is the, you know, the dislike of immigration, trade, and foreign wars. I think that strain of the party is not going away. I don't think that faction of the party, the Buchananist faction, is necessarily going to remain running the party for, you know, continuously for the next 20 years. But you know, even as a matter of the map, if you look at the map, right, why was Trump so successful in 2016? Because he reoriented Republicans away from kind of the George W. Bush theory of the map, which is, you know, Texas, Florida, Arizona, kind of, you know, we need to broaden our appeal in those places, to saying, wait a minute, what about the Midwest? Bush is actually the only Republican president in history to win the White House without winning the Midwest, right? And so Trump went back to those old Republican roots, and broke down the so-called blue wall. But when you look at 2024, 2028, those states are all going to be losing electoral votes. They're going to be losing House seats, and those seats are, you know, it's like a Springsteen song, you know, they're going south, boys, and they ain't coming back. Right. So those seats are going to Florida, Texas, Arizona. Yeah. And so I think a Republican, I think I think that the Buchananite strain that runs very well in the Midwest, I think that's going to continue to be part of the party, and I think you're not going to see a return to a fully George W. Bush style, um, you know, outlook on
Right.
internationalism and immigration. But I do think that you will see. I don't think that you're going to see a fully Buchananite party either, because I think I just think that the map suggests that Republicans are going to turn their attentions in a different direction by the next two election cycles.
These things pivot on the smallest thing. Like, George Bush wins that. I guess we would say, historic path, kind of presidency. And also, you had an incumbent based candidate, granted vice president, who didn't win his home state. Like if he wins Kentucky, he wins. That's it. It's over. But he couldn't even win his home state, and so these improbable things stack up. I wanted to ask you this about, so I'm not a big Trump supporter. I'm certainly not a Joe Biden supporter. I don't think he can handle the job physically, mentally, whatever. But we had all this time, right, for the left to stand up someone who could have run. We have a, at least until he proves otherwise, an incapable, physically, mentally incapable president, and then a vice president who was slaughtered by one question in the debates from Tulsi Gabbard. Why not just Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard as a ticket? It's people of color, they're likable, and just not jerks. They're not establishment cronies. I mean, if they would have picked that, I don't see how Donald Trump wins.
Maybe. I
Okay.
mean, look, I think what the Democrats really needed was, more than anything, was they just needed a 10 years younger Joe Biden. I mean, not that Biden is any kind of a great candidate. There's a reason why he's been running for president for 33 years before getting the nomination.
I love it.
But I think that a lot of the things that Biden is, I honestly thought that their best candidate was Klobuchar, of the people who were at least got themselves off the ground. Anyway, I mean,
Right.
Beto O'Rourke, for example. I think the 2018 edition of Beto might have been a very successful candidate, but I think he really along the way kind of veered way too hard to the left. And some of that was stuff that was there in his candidacy all along that people just overlooked when he ran in Texas. But
Right.
I think making the switch out of feeling he was appealing to a Texas electorate kind of sank him. But and look, part of what makes Yang appealing, I mean, he's a nice guy and all, but also part of it makes him appealing is that empty vessel thing of not having been in politics. He may actually run for mayor in New York, and I think he would be. He's one of about 330 million Americans who would be an upgrade on Bill de Blasio in that job. And there's historically not been a political future after running for mayor, after being mayor in New York. But he may look quite different if he takes that job, because he may succeed or he may fail. And I don't know whether he's even going to run or win the nomination. But I mean, I think it is. The one thing there to remember too, the personality is so much of this stuff, both personality and personal biography, right? I mean, why did Biden do so well in so many of the places he did? And a lot of it was simply, it's not so much being Joe Biden, it was being Obama's vice president. And so a lot of his, loyalty with the black community in particular, I think was attributable to that more so than to who Biden is himself.
One last question, and this is just sort of a freestyle question that I like to ask people that have this kind of knowledge. Who was the last president that didn't just openly enrich themselves? And why do we get so mad at Donald Trump for when he does it?
I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I would say that say George H.W. Bush or Reagan really was enriching themselves in office.
Okay.
Or even even really W. I mean, look, they all cash in obviously on the easy one that they cash in on is post-presidential memoirs, and you can make so much more money on that than on anything else that you don't really need to. I think the real kind of hand in the pockets scandals tend to be more a matter of like people lower in the chain than the president.
I mean, how many books turn into hundreds of millions of dollars, though? I mean, there's a lot of wealth being created, you know.
Yeah, and it is kind of a bribe in itself, right? Just that ability to, most of these guys are not like U.S. Grant scratching out his memoirs, to try to keep his family out of the poorhouse.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think Trump gets in trouble for it because of just the, part of Trump's whole drain the swamp thing. I think is it's much less about ending the corruption in Washington than in ending the pretense that it's not corruption. And so he's, I think he has done a number of things that are kind of just a little more open versions of what other people were already doing, but doing smoothly with lawyers and with, nice words and statements and, maybe keeping things a little more properly legal, but not any more ethical.
I'm going to sneak one more in. President Trump is running on, I'm going to work on term limits. Do you believe him?
He'll probably send out a few tweets and stuff, but I mean, I don't think term limits for the most part are a good idea. And I don't think that he could accomplish them anyway.
My normal response to term limits is I'm like, well, vote your guy out. And then the answer almost always is, but I like my guy.
Yeah. So well, that's the problem. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll give you the opportunity. If you want to, you can ask me a question. I've hammered you for an hour, and thank you for that. Do you have a question you want to ask me?
I didn't come with one prepared, other than thank you for having me on the show, and it's been a great discussion. Yeah, and one of the best ways to support Dan is to go to National Review and read his columns. Those clicks matter, and you can always hit him up on Twitter. Look in the show notes for all that information if you're not watching live right now. And just everybody, these conversations. Look, we didn't have a political conversation. We had a rigorous conversation about things that we don't like about these things. We can have these conversations, you guys. We really can. Dan, thanks so much for coming on a Friday and hanging out with me. I appreciate it. Come back and for sure, anytime you want to say something, I'd love to have you on. All right. Thanks. I'm going to push the